Alright, this is going to be my second episode today. I wanted to... See, I've been working on this for a minute. Not very long, but longer than I was working on the Howard Schultz thing, obviously. But, I wanted to talk today a little bit more about the media and their past, and... Yeah, I'm gonna be talking about this, Carl Bernstein shit, Carl Bernstein, the guy that broke Watergate. He had this other thing that he worked on, where he broke this whole operation the CIA did, called Operation Mockingbird. I'm gonna relate that to some other stuff. Yeah, so the United States has, a notoriously long history with anti-communist action. The question is to what extent to which they've gone. There are plenty of things the CIA has done which we will never know, even given their terrible track record when it comes to human rights. Of course, the things that would be expected to cause their downfall should be classified. We would expect that, right? But either way, with what has been released, they're so historically bad they shouldn't be a trustworthy organization. And they honestly, in my opinion, shouldn't be an organization. I understand the use of intelligence agencies, fine, but the CIA, they've crossed the line so many times. Yeah, they're more than professionals at lying on paper and in formal statements. They're probably the best ever at that stuff. In person, I don't know so much. I watched this video of a former director, and he just blew his cover, pretty much. This reporter asked if they still meddle in elections, and he was like, yeah. It's just like, what the hell? So you do. And so I already knew about Operation Mockingbird, so I was like, it's about time I did something on Operation Mockingbird. I talk about it, in brief in my first video, but this is pretty much, it's important for people to know about. I didn't know about this for a long time, and it's just about time I made a video on it. So, Operation Mockingbird is an action the government took against socialism, discovered and researched and released by iconic Watergate journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner Carl Bernstein in 1977. It was where news outlets were infiltrated, such as the New York Times, NBC, Associated Press, United Press International, CBS, Time Magazine, Reuters, the Miami Herald, Newsweek, Life Magazine, New York Herald Tribune, and Copley News Services. Those were all a big part of it. Quote from Bernstein: by far the most valuable of these associations, according to CIA officials, have been with the New York Times, CBS, and Time Incorporated. Funnily enough, not many U.S. Americans seem to appreciate or even know about it. The intent of the operation was to spread anti-communist disinformation and pro-United States propaganda, and this action was started by Frank Wisner. I'm pretty sure he was a director of the CIA. If it's not, then he was someone who was important. As many as 400 journalists, including Pulitzer Prize winners, participated in this covert action. According to a high-level CIA official, the New York Times provided cover for about 10 CIA operatives between 1950 and 1966. By the way, all these quotes are coming from Bernstein in his website that he created in 2007, where he just copied and pasted his story on Operation Mockingbird that he originally published in Rolling Stone. But yeah, many of these companies were unaware of such involvement. So the CIA's use of the American news media has been much more extensive than the agency acknowledged publicly, according to Bernstein, or in closed sessions with members of Congress. The general outlines of what happened are indisputable. The specifics are harder to come by. The journalists... my bad. The CIA sources hint that a particular journalist was trafficking all over Eastern Europe for the agency, The journalist says no, he just had lunch with the station chief. CIA sources say flatly that a well-known ABC correspondent worked for the agency through 1973, and they refused to identify him. A high-level CIA official with a prodigious memory says that the New York Times provided cover for about 10 CIA operatives between 1950 and 1966. He doesn't know who they were, or who in the newspaper's management made the arrangements. Bernstein goes on to claim some of the, quote, best-known correspondents in the business were also in on this operation. One specific reporter, Hal Hendricks, a reporter who covered Latin America and won the Pulitzer Prize, he was noted by Bernstein as one of the agency's most valuable personal relationships in the 1960s. According to CIA officials, according to CIA officials, he also claims the director and deputy director of the CIA would usually be the ones to coordinate plans with the top management members of media outlets. He also cites the eerie and suspect vagueness of the report given by the Senate Intelligence Committee's final report on the matter. Quote, during the 1976 investigation of the CIA by the Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church, the dimensions of the agency's involvement with the press became apparent to several members of the panel, as well as to 2 or 3 investigators on the staff. But top officials of the CIA, including former directors William Colby and George Bush, persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry into the matter and deliberately misinterpret the actual scope of the activities in its final report. The multi-volume report contains 9 pages in which the use of journalists is discussed in deliberately vague and sometimes misleading terms. It makes no mention of the actual number of journalists who undertook covert CIA, nor does it adequately describe the role played by newspaper and broadcast executives in cooperating with the agency. So even though there was concrete data handed over to the committee, the report completely failed to provide it. What should have been a massive breach in trust by the agency was apparently seen as not that big of a deal, considering the specifics were left out and the committee left the people to simply wonder about what happened for 2 decades. We can calm down a little though, because Bernstein said during his writing that involvement had died down in the last few years since 1973. But that dwindling of CIA involvement in journalism might as well have been in direct response to William Colby's response to the matter. We should still be very alarmed at the lasting impact this CIA involvement has brought, though. We still have plenty of people saying things like, socialism has never worked, whenever the United States has simply made sure that it hasn't, or made up an image that it hadn't at the time. But, here's another quote from Bernstein. American publishers, like so many other corporate and institutional leaders at the time, were willing to commit the resources of their companies to the struggle against global communism. Accordingly, the traditional line separating the American press corps and government was often indistinguishable. Rarely was a news agency used to provide cover for CIA operatives abroad without the knowledge and consent of either its principal owner, publisher, or senior editor. Thus, contrary to the notion that CIA insidiously infiltrated the journalistic community, there is ample evidence that America's leading publishers and news executives allowed themselves and their organizations to become handmaidens to the intelligence services. Quote, "Let's not pick on some poor reporters, for God's sake," William Colby exclaimed at one point to the church committee's investigators. Quote, "Let's go to the managements. They were witting." End quote. In all, about 25 news organizations, including those listed at the beginning of this article, provided cover for the agency. In addition to cover capability, Dulles I'm assuming either Alan Dulles or Joshua Dulles, initiated a debriefing procedure under which American correspondents returning from abroad routinely emptied their notebooks and offered their impressions to agency personnel. Such arrangements, continued by Dulles' successors to the present day, were made with literally dozens of news organizations. In the 1950s, it was not uncommon for returning reporters to be met at the ship by CIA officers. Quote, there would be these guys from the CIA flashing ID cards and looking like they belonged at the Yale Club, said Hugh Morrow, a former Saturday Evening Post correspondent, who is now press secretary to former Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. Quote, it got to be so routine that you felt a little miffed if you weren't asked. End quote. And it wasn't just that these people were reporting what they found. They were specifically being told what to look for by the CIA officials before going abroad. They were practically given missions by the agency to find information which was useful to it. In essence, they were just puppets with the guise of being honest individuals, just coming upon things without bias or motive. This part is even worse, so just listen to this. Quote, on one occasion, according to several CIA officials, Sulzberger was given a briefing paper by the agency which ran almost verbatim under the columnist's byline in the Times. End quote. If they as individuals had no bias or motive, the mission they were given was based off a bias or motive, or their story may have simply been provided to them by the agency, completely ruining the idea of honest journalism. Hell, the lead foreign correspondent for the New York Times, Cyrus Sulzberger, towed the line of blatantly lying about his work with the CIA. He said he would never be near the, quote, spook business, which I don't really know what he meant by that word, but let's assume that he meant what, could be assumed. Even though CIA officials said he signed a secrecy agreement upon being given classified information. When questioned about the agreement, he said he couldn't remember if he signed one, saying it was a, quote, bubble in a bathtub. Like, how many times are you approached by CIA members with something you're supposed to sign? I'm not sure, but I can't imagine he was approached that many times. What's next up, though, is worrying. I decided to use a super long quote because I couldn't figure out when the highlighting stopped being necessary. Stuart Alsop. Stuart Alsop's relationship with the agency was much more extensive than Sulzberger's. He was a well-known journalist at the time. One official who served at the highest levels of the CIA said flatly, Stu Alsop was a CIA agent. End quote. An equally senior official refused to define Alsop's relationship with the agency except to say it was a formal one. Other sources said that Alsop was particularly helpful to the agency in discussions with officials of foreign governments, asking questions to which the CIA was seeking news, planting misinformation advantageous to American policy, assessing opportunities for the CIA recruitment of well-placed foreigners. Quote, absolute nonsense, says Joseph Alsop, of the notion that his brother was a CIA agent. Quote, I was closer to the agency than Stu was, though Stu was very close. I dare say he did perform some tasks. He just did the correct thing as an American. ... The founding fathers of the CIA were close personal friends of ours. Dick Bissell, former CIA deputy director, was my oldest friend from childhood. It was a social thing, my dear fellow. I never received $1. I never signed a secrecy agreement. I didn't have to. I've done things for them when I thought they were the right thing to do. I call it doing my duty as a citizen. Alsop was willing to discuss on the record only 2 of the tasks he undertook. A visit to Laos in 1952 at the behest of Frank Wisner, who felt other American reporters were using anti-American sources about uprisings there, and a visit to the Philippines in 1953 when the CIA thought his presence there might affect the outcome of the election. Quote, Des Fitzgerald urged me to go, Alsop recalled. Quote, it would be less likely that the election could be stolen by opponents of Ramon Magsaysay if the eyes of the world were on them. I stayed with the ambassador and wrote about what happened. End quote. Alsop maintains that he was never manipulated by the agency. Quote, you can't get entangled, so they have leverage on you, end quote, he said. But what I wrote was true. My view was to get the facts If someone in the agency was wrong, I stopped talking to them. They had given me phony goods." End quote. On one occasion, Alsop said Richard Helms authorized the head of the agency's analytical branch to provide Alsop with information on Soviet military presence along the Chinese border. Quote, "The analytical side of the agency had been dead wrong about the war in Vietnam. They thought it couldn't be won," said Alsop. "And they were wrong on the Soviet buildup. I stopped talking to them." End quote. Today, he says, quote, "People in our business would be outraged at the kinds of suggestions that were made to me. They shouldn't be. The CIA did not open itself to all people. It did not trust. Stu and I were trusted, and I'm proud of it." Alsop seems, at least to me, to be a person of great use to the agency. He was somebody who certainly felt like he had all the freedom in the world to go about his way as he pleased while doing work for the CIA. Meanwhile, only picking at very trivial things when citing wrongdoings by the agency. He still knowingly attempted to meddle in elections in a different country, even if all he did was report facts. He was told his presence alone may affect the outcome. He may have been right about not being manipulated. That's not the topic of interest, though. The topic of interest is the United States Intelligence Agency being used to perform a psychological operation on the people themselves, not the people reporting the news, to spread a pro-U.S. and anti-communist campaign. Like Alsop said, the agency made sure these journalists were trusted so they didn't need to use manipulation tactics to succeed. Essentially, for at least 20 years, the narrative on communism was completely tainted with anti-communist propaganda and disinformation. As an ideal example, certain articles, such as those overseen by Henry Luce of Time magazine, being outright edited to fit the narrative fitting the United States against communism. This has had a devastating impact on class consciousness in the United States, leading to every conversation about the topic being driven into the ground by browbeating. This isn't the only, apparent, anti-communist presence in American media. We still today have a unanimous pro-war campaign amongst news anchors and analysts. There have been honest, news campaigns in the past, such as during the Iran-Contra scandal, but the general outrage was not because of the funding of the Contras going against the Sandinista government, which was communist, but because of the dealings with Iran, who was the United States' mortal enemy after the hostage crisis during the Carter administration and the beginning of the Reagan administration. There was still a very anti-communist and socialist sentiment in the media in the 80s, as everybody should already know. There's also the case to be made that our media has been anti-communist in every situation besides that of World War II, when we didn't want to piss off the Soviet Union, who is doing most of the fighting for us. Right before World War II, we had a huge Nazi presence in our media. If you look at William Randolph Hearst, who did a ton of anti-communist work, he had people like Adolf Hitler, he quoted Mussolini. I'm pretty sure he might have had Adolf Hitler even write something for his newspaper. He hung out with Joseph Goebbels. I'm pretty sure he rode in a plane with Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler at one point. He was a really bad guy. He had people go over to the Soviet Union and spread deliberate disinformation and all that kind of stuff. He had people with fake names, not just aliases, a lot of fake names, people who didn't exist, to go over there and spread disinformation, use pictures from the past to describe what was going on at the then current time. And even today, an operation of disinformation on socialist and socialist acting countries is apparent. Hence the counter information I cite in my video on Venezuela. The amount of lies I see are something I believe is unprecedented. If it's not, then my God, whoever morphs the reality of these situations is really, really, really good at their job. So this is really just, I really just wanted to make this video to, make a further case on the video I made a couple of weeks ago on the media. If this information is useful, let me know. If it's not, and if there's any inaccuracies, please leave a comment. If you like the video, leave a comment. Comment whatever you want. I don't really care. Unless it's, some really bad shit. Have a good one. This is Fox News Daily.